Hello, everyone. Want to welcome you to the last session of GPF 2021. Over the past 3 days, we've heard from people all over the world, many on the front lines. We've also come to understand that the meaning of health is more than just seeing the doctor. It's well-being, not just of an individual, but of society and communities. And that health includes issues like poverty, lack of education, lack of clean water, and hunger. All of us assembled here push resources and ideas into the various countries and regions in an effort to address these big problems. And one purpose of GPF is to help us all think strategically. Therefore, it's critical that we hear from another key global player, the US government. So as the world is left reeling from pandemic as well as lingering uncertainty about America's global role, we turn to a prominent voice for principled engagement on the world stage, USAID Administrator Ambassador Samantha Power. Regarded as an influential driver of US policy and a tireless advocate for human rights and democracy, Ambassador Power has long been committed to promoting international cooperation in an effort to advance sustainable solutions to global challenges. And while serving as US Ambassador to the UN, Ambassador Powers rallied countries to combat the Ebola pandemic, worked to negotiate the ambitious sustainable development goals, and defended civil society from growing repression. Welcome, Ambassador Samantha Powers. We're so pleased that you're here. Thank you for making the time.
Great to be here, and welcome everybody.
So let's go right to it. So we know that official foreign assistance used to represent about 80% of all capital flows to developing countries. Now it's something like 10%. What role do you see for philanthropic organizations in strengthening development and humanitarian assistance outcomes in partner countries? And maybe you can talk about also what the comparative advantages of each sector is in their respective roles.
Great. Well, first, maybe I'd start with a statement of the obvious, which is the problems are really quite formidable right now. The challenges, we're all heading into COP. I'll say a word in a second about what philanthropists and foundations have done in the climate space, which is monumental. But none of us can look at even the bipartisan support that USAID now has managed over many years, and the very generous contributions of the taxpayer, up to $27 billion budget every year across a range of sectors, so important. And yet, compared to COVID-related fallout, the intensification of climate shocks, more displaced people in the world today than at any point since World War II, since Hitler. The changing complexity, even of the migration challenges at the southern border, different nationalities now coming, reflecting sometimes democratic backsliding, sometimes increased physical insecurity, and gang violence in particular countries, often just economic despair. I mean, there's a lot going on, and one can get daunted. Again, particularly, I think some of the climate trends can cast people into that frame of mind. But the other way to look at it is, all right, if not now, then when? Right? It's all hands on deck. Governments, have responded, and maybe we'll get to talk about COVID and what the Biden administration has done in now moving out to try to build a coalition to vaccinate the world and treat people who are afflicted by COVID. But there's just so many dimensions of this that the public sector alone, won't be able to meet. So that's the sort of predicate, I guess, for the question. In terms of comparative advantages, I think, well, let me say one other thing, which is USAID actually, has really built out over many years, more than I had understood before I took this wonderful job, its capacity for working with the private sector. And it does that both at headquarters. We have the wonderful Michael Meltzer in charge of our private sector hub. But most impressively, it's kind of scrappy USAID mission staff out in the real world, cooking up private sector partnerships to grow, small land holding, farm, products and bring them to market in rural Guatemala, in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, where USAID bears the risk on the front end with a modest investment, maybe just $500,000. But that's enough for the private sector to say, okay, well, if you're bearing the risk, why don't we come in? And then lo and behold, you get an order of magnitude more out of what more than what the farmers were doing before. Such a modest investment by us that is leveraged to produce 3, 4, 5 times as much for the farmer. And then that in turn gets leveraged to bring resources back to the community because of the sales on the market. So I think on private sector outreach, both in the field, there's always more we can do, and especially given the scale of the challenges, but USAID has come a long way, and the structures have grown up. Another example is the USAID administrator is the vice chair of the Development Finance Corporation. So also, the old OPIC, which is now DFC, is out there. Dave Marchik today is in India and South Africa scouting potential partners for vaccine manufacturing, so we can extend equitable, have more equitable vaccine manufacturing around the world, so it's not all concentrated in a few places and with a few companies. And so he's out there scouting. USAID missions around the world are, deal spotting, and because our field presence is our comparative advantage, and maybe can be for you as well as philanthropists. So we have these missions. They're out there looking. What can we do about climate adaptation, where the private sector traditionally hasn't really wanted to go in the same way that they have, in terms of transition to renewables. We can be your eyes and ears. But the infrastructure that I mentioned that we have on the private sector, we actually don't have as much of that when it comes to engaging philanthropists, foundations, et cetera. And so that's one of the things in my tenure, given the gap between the needs in the world and the resources that the public sector alone and even with the private sector can provide, we need to build out that connective tissue to all of you. And if you have ideas and want to follow up, please come to me, because this is a very exciting part of our reform and modernization agenda. Very briefly, just on comparative advantages, because I've gone on too long. Our appropriations process at USAID, between the time someone has an idea, whether me or, again, a great Rwandan development officer or agricultural expert, in Guatemala, when they have an idea, and when we are actually able to flow resources toward that idea, think of the life of any appropriation cycle. Be lucky if it's 2 years between, the idea and the getting the money for, let's say, a new initiative. You can move things around, of course, within a mission up to a point. Philanthropists can just move really, really quickly. And I think we've seen this even on the vaccine manufacturing is a good example, where a number of foundations went out and began scouting and actually drawing connections between some of the large pharmaceutical companies and, potential partners in Senegal, in Rwanda, in South Africa. And you saw that. So thinking through what is that catalytic, fast moving, more nimble, you don't have to deal with all branches of government, right, to get it in. There's no interagency process. Hopefully, I'm sure you have boards and those are, but just as we're trying to make USAID more fit for purpose, more fit for this moment, swifter, and to compress some of those timelines that have saddled our ability to move quickly. So too, I think have most boards in response, especially to the COVID fallout. So I think there's often we'll be at the table saying, okay, we can do this share of this new water project, or this new food security initiative, or this new anti-corruption endeavor, which I hope we'll have a chance to talk about, democracy and governance. And that's a big slice of it. And we're lucky that we're the public sector and that the Congress has been so generous to give us that, but we're still not resourced to move this initiative out of the Capitol, where we know, many of the issues are lying, in the rural areas. And other donors, Germany has stepped up in big ways of late. Japan remains, a great development donor. The European Union, of course, goes without saying. But most donors have not significantly increased their assistance commensurate with the increase in needs that have flown from both, again, the intensification of climate effects and the pandemic. So the gap is widening, even as governments remain, very interested in programming in all these areas. it's just, this is why food rations are being cut in places where the UN is operating. It's not that most governments aren't giving less in the pandemic, but it's just food needs are swallowing up whatever new resources are brought online.
So, Ambassador Power, I was struck by your desire to reach out to private foundations and philanthropy sector in general. We've had 3 days of conference with all these different foundations and funders. Is there a way for them to contact your staff directly to talk about? Because I know that there are a lot of ideas that have been put across about where, to maximize what we call these kinds of cross-sector partnerships. Maybe we could get that from our staff. Is there something that you would recommend?
Yeah, but my chief of staff is going to kill me, but G Maltz at USAID.gov, Gideon Maltz, who I had the chance to work with as well at USUN. He ran the Tent Foundation for Hamdi, who some of you know, the CEO of Chobani, building out this private sector, kind of effort to support refugees who had come in the wake of the Arab Spring. And now, of course, we have that challenge that many of you are interested as well in supporting, about how we support our Afghan brothers and sisters. Anyway, Gideon comes from that background, and we would love to hear from you, to talk to you. And I think in my experience, there are two ways to do it. One is just talk to us about what you think your comparative advantages are, and then let us go off and think about where that can plug in. But the other way is around a problem set, which is, you care a lot about migration in the Northern Triangle,
Right.
or labor rights in Bangladesh, or again, adaptation. This when so many countries are dealing with such setbacks to the development gains that all of us had invested in over such a long period of time. Tell us what you care about, and then we can look at what we're doing and again, matchmake with missions and projects that maybe just nascent or maybe far along, where you can come in and make the critical difference, to something that we've baked with the government. Because I guess that's the other comparative advantage, perhaps, that we can offer you, which is our relations with host governments, our ability to go right into the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Agriculture. On the governance and human rights, it can be a little harder, because sometimes what we're supporting together are the civil society partners, the independent media that are holding government accountable. That's often what we're doing together. But when we have moments of reform, let me put this on your radar if I can. I'm sorry, but this I'm very excited about, which is that we all lament the democracy authoritarian trend lines, right? 15 straight years of freedom in decline, but there are bright spots happening right now. Sudan, a female-led set of political protests overthrew Bashir, the genocidal dictator who ran Sudan for 30 years. But the fledgling civilian government is really struggling. It's really hard to undo the damage caused by a government that commits genocide and is completely corrupt. And yet the hunger for engagement from people like you or from the private sector is off the charts, and the political will is off the charts, but the degree of difficulty as well. So too, I just back from the Dominican Republic, in our own hemisphere, tremendous effort to rebuild a police force from scratch, to make government transparent, to move beyond all the cliches about anti-corruption,